This is episode 398 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Ralph Goldswain, author of No Sweat Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In the reign of Elizabeth I, the image of King Arthur wasn't just a relic of medieval romance. It was a living symbol of England's past. And for the Tudors, it was a powerful tool for shaping England's future. From pageants and progresses to poetry and portraiture, Arthur's legendary court at Camelot became part of the language of politics, nationalism, and royal identity. This week, we're exploring how the Tudors claimed Arthur as their own, why his legend resonated so strongly with Elizabethan audiences, and how literature, art, and performance helped keep Arthur's image alive in the 16th century. Our guest this week is Andrew Hadfield, professor of English at the University of Sussex and author of numerous works on Renaissance literature, including studies of Edmund Spenser, Shakespeare, and the political use of myth. His research on Arthurian traditions in Tudor England reveals how myths of King Arthur were adapted for political purposes, how they appeared in literature like The Fairy Queen, and the ways these stories shaped English national identity during Elizabeth I's reign. Drawing on records of pageantry, royal progresses, and visual symbolism, Andrew brings the Arthurian legend vividly to life for the world that Shakespeare knew. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to give you a quick reminder that there's bonus visual content available for our patrons. This week, the extras include paintings and depictions of King Arthur, more information on Elizabeth I's progresses around the country, and images of primary documents and artifacts related to the Tudors' love of Arthurian legends. Just head to CassidyCash.com/episode 398 and click Access the Extras to explore all the bonus content while you listen to the show. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Andrew. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, Cassidy. Lovely to be here.
In the 16th century, to what extent did Tudor rulers and the people around them, too, believe that King Arthur was real? Was he an actual historical figure rather than purely this legendary figure?
It's a really interesting and difficult to answer question that I shall take a bit of time over. One of the first things is that Henry VII, the first of the Tudor kings, his first son was called Arthur. As probably everyone knows, Arthur would have been the next king, but sadly died, leaving the second son, Henry VIII, the spare, to become king and to marry his widow, Catherine of Aragon, which caused all sorts of problems later on. But the question is, it's never been clear whether Arthur would have been called Arthur II. So we'll never find that out because the poor young man died before he ever got to be king. But clearly there were those around the Tudors who took the Arthurian legends very seriously. They may have believed that they were absolutely true. They may have just found them historically convenient. It's often very hard to excavate that kind of difference between what people want to believe and what they actually do believe. But the Arthurian legends in the 16th century are a cause of contentious debate. There are those who feel that they were definitely true and that Arthur was a real figure. And there are those who thought that they were largely bogus and invented just to big up the Tudor dynasty. There was a great debate between a man called John Leland, who was the one who did believe in the Arthurian legends, the matter of Britain. He's a man who walks around Britain uncovering all sorts of interesting things about its past. He was very clear that the Arthurian legends were correct. There was an Italian humanist called Polydore Virgil who thought this was all rubbish. And the two had a kind of serious argument in the early 16th century, which was curtailed rather when poor old John Leland descended into madness, probably a result of his excessive labours. The legends were always contentious, and in some ways they were very, very important. In other ways, they fizzle out a bit after the early part of the 16th century. The person who's responsible for really revitalizing them is a 12th century historian called Geoffrey of Monmouth, who writes a book called The History of the Kings of Britain, which is the first fleshing out of the legends of Arthur. This is incredibly popular in the 16th century, and lots of people make use of it. One of the people who does make use of it is John Dee, a contemporary of Shakespeare's, who is often seen as the first founder of the British Empire. He founds the legends of King Arthur incredibly useful in claiming that the Britons had an ancient empire which stretched all over the north and went up to Iceland and Norway and so on, and all sorts of lands were supposedly conquered by the Britons, and this gave them the green light to set up to revitalize that empire later on. But there are others who are much more skeptical about whether the Arthurian legends were actually true.
How did the Tudors use the image of King Arthur to shape English nationalism?
That's also an interesting question. On the one hand, well, there are different versions of King Arthur. There's the History of the Kings of Britain version of Geoffrey of Monmouth, where Arthur is a great king who is eventually brought low by his kind of invasion by Mordred, sometimes his illegitimate son, sometimes his nephew in different versions of the tale, which leads to an apocalyptic battle with Arthur going, but there's always the legend that he will return at some point. That's a familiar feature of the Arthurian legend. So that's one of the fundamental stories. The other version of the legends is the one that everyone will know as well, which is the French version, which concentrates on Lancelot, the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere being very important, King Arthur moving very much into the background as a figure who is the king at the round table, but doesn't always do all that much. As you'll see, the legends are very complicated. On the one hand, King Arthur is a great warrior king who justifies conquest. On the other hand, his empire does not end well. His wife sees another man. In some versions, it's Mordred. In some versions, it's Lancelot. And this leads to a fracturing of the kingdom and the destruction of the Arthurian Empire. So there's always an anxiety about the Arthurian legends. On the one hand, Arthur is Britain's greatest legendary king. On the other hand, everything goes totally wrong. So when the Arthurian legends are represented, they often have that inbuilt ambiguity that this is Britain's greatest triumph and it's also its greatest period of apocalyptic destruction. And the Tudors are constantly being warned about this. There's a play probably written in part by a man called Arthur Hughes called The Misfortunes of Arthur, which is one of the few plays written about King Arthur in the 1580s. And that is about Mordred having an affair with Guinevere. Arthur overstretches his empire, trying to expand Britain too much. And in the end, the queen goes off with Mordred, and there's an apocalyptic battle, familiar motif, that ends in destruction. And it's a warning, or the play is often seen as a warning. Make sure you keep everything together. Don't allow things to become disunited. Don't overstretch yourself. If you overstretch yourself with overseas conquest, you may find that things go terribly wrong at home. And that's a warning you get often in the Arthurian legends. People at this point, someone like John Dee, are very, very keen to use the Arthurian legends as a blueprint for empire, as a justification for a British empire. Others say, no, be careful. Keep the realm coherent. The Arthurian legends tell you not to go too far abroad. So the legends have both a nationalistic sense, but also a national warning of disunity, and that's why they're such interesting kind of legends to think about, and why they're so important in the 16th century, when Britain had been, or England was united after a divisive civil war, the Wars of the Roses, in the 15th century, which spawned one of the most famous Arthurian legends. The Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur is all about the kind of disunity of the kingdom against the background of different kings claiming the crown.
And when it comes to bringing this history, whether it's aspirational or to warn people, how they're manifesting Arthur's story, they had a lot of spectacular events to work with when presenting these stories. Court entertainments were lavish indoor performances for the monarch, while civic pageants were grand public displays with music, costumes, and allegory staged in the streets. Andrew, could you walk us through an example of one of these events where Arthurian themes were used to reinforce the queen's authority or perhaps her lineage?
Very good. Yeah, I can give you two. There's one for Henry VIII, a much earlier one, a spectacular event that takes place, which I'll just refer to briefly, in 1522, when the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V came over, which tried to show the affinity between the Habsburg dynasty and the Britons through Arthur, and it was cast as an anti-French story. So the French are the sort of enemies of the great Arthurian legends, so that Henry VIII and Charles V are shown to both go back to Arthur. So that's one way of using the Arthurian legends to try and foster unity. They were used not all that often, but they were very famously used in 1575 at Kenilworth, the kind of house of the Earl of Leicester, who certainly had dynastic ambitions and may have been using the Queen's presence at his castle to try and suggest that he would be a suitable husband for her. So there's certainly that background to them, and I'll say a bit more about that particular version of things. The Queen was very good at going on progresses throughout England, trying to go to different parts of the realm to show herself to her subjects as part of a way of fostering an English unity. So this is on one of her progresses. She must have worn herself out because she went on a lot of these, but she goes to Kenilworth in 1575, and the Earl of Leicester has his gardens festooned with all sorts of Arthurian symbols as the Queen arrives, so that she kind of gets the point that she is the successor to the mighty King Arthur, and that she is another monarch who is fostering the unity of the realm. Now, what Leicester does, and some of this might need a bit more unpacking than I have probably got time to do now. He puts up the arms of Roger Mortimer. Roger Mortimer is a famous kind of ancestor of the Earl of Leicester, who staged a tournament, a very Arthurian tournament in 1279. He was a well-known figure. People would have recognized him then, as they probably don't now, showing the Queen that Leicester has Arthurian connections himself as the Queen enters his kind of castle grounds. The Lady of the Lake. I'm sure viewers will be familiar with the idea of the Lady of the Lake, the figure, mysterious woman who hands Arthur his great sword Excalibur, which is told in Le Morte d'Arthur, the Thomas Malory version, and in lots and lots of other versions of the Arthurian legend. So the Lady of the Lake appears, greets the Queen, approaches her. The two kind of talk about the Queen's future. So that the Lady of the Lake shows that she is sent to serve Elizabeth just as she served Arthur, forming a great link between the two of them. The Queen then walks through the grounds of the castle, and she encounters all sorts of symbols of Avalon. Avalon, another very potent feature of the Arthurian myth. Avalon is the place where Arthur supposedly goes when he dies, or is supposed to die, leaving it unsure whether he is in fact being taken to a mystical realm, because the myth is always Arthur is the once and future king. Rex quondam rexque futuris is the motto, the idea that Arthur will come back. So in using the myth of Avalon throughout Queen's progress throughout the castle grounds, Leicester is definitely trying to suggest that the Queen is the reincarnation of King Arthur, that she has come back, the great mighty warrior queen who is the second form of Arthur. The Lady of the Lake is then imprisoned in one of the pageantry bits by Sir Bruce sans pity, Sir Bruce without pity, and he imprisons the Lady of the Lake because she has imprisoned Arthur's great magician Merlin, who's a very ambiguous figure in the Arthurian legends. In some ways a great hero, in other ways a kind of magician who may be linked to diabolic arts. But the story told at Kenilworth is that only a holy virgin, i.e. Queen Elizabeth, can release the Lady of the Lake, again linking her to King Arthur. The whole pageant is very much festooned with clever use of symbols, so that Arthurian symbols are mixed with classical wood folk symbols. So there's a kind of mixture of classical Ovidian symbols with Arthurian symbols. And the whole point, I would suggest, is that this is a unity, a dynasty, a connection between someone who has an Arthurian past with the Queen who has an Arthurian presence, and that they should probably get together and form a dynasty that will cement England and Britain's future. It doesn't happen. I can't provide any insight as to why that didn't actually go any further. It was probably too difficult and controversial. Queens had a terrible time about who they married. They either married a foreign king, in which case everybody got really anxious about whether the realm had become subservient to another realm, or they married one of their subjects, in which case one particular faction became very powerful and other factions got very fed up and possibly aggressive. That may be why the Queen ducked out of this, or maybe she was just fed up with the Earl of Leicester. I don't know.
Well, that's fed up with him as an option I hadn't considered, but it makes sense given the overwhelming presentation. I mean, obviously, we can see the fascination and the sort of over the top here with the performance. But I want to also explore the idea of presenting these stories in particular places. Royal progresses were Elizabeth's tours around the country, and they did stay with nobles, and making these visits, they were symbolic on their own where she chose to stop. Some stops, like Caerleon in Wales or Tintagel in Cornwall, already had legendary ties to King Arthur. Were there progresses or ceremonies in these locations? And if so, how were those connections highlighted?
It's an interesting question. There is less evidence on this than you might think. I mean, one of the things I think that does happen with the Arthurian legends is there are periods of intense interest in them, and then they sort of move into the background. So, as I've said, in the early years of Henry VIII's reign, and certainly with Prince Arthur, there's a lot of interest in the Arthurian legends. Certainly with Queen Elizabeth, there's quite a lot of interest at various points, but there's not so many connections with particular places. Glastonbury is, of course, associated with the Arthurian legends, and supposedly King Arthur's grave was discovered there by the monks at Glastonbury in 1191. Very convenient, and it sort of made Glastonbury very famous and rich, and lots of pilgrims went there, and they did very well out of this. I think even by the Tudor times, people were a bit skeptical about this. But there is evidence of people being interested in Glastonbury. Tintagel, there's not so much of a evidence as you might expect. There are some coins discovered around Tintagel which suggest, Elizabethan coins, suggest that people did go there, but not so much is made of these. The pageants tend to be staged either in London or in the castles of the particular noblemen who were associated with Arthur, really.
If you're enjoying the history you're learning about today and want to go one step further, consider joining Experience Shakespeare. Come inside where you can try out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the 16th century. Plus, you can explore Shakespeare's world through virtual tours, animated plays, and a full library of printable resources. Experience Shakespeare is a community of history lovers who, like you, want to go beyond just listening and truly live the history. Why just learn about Shakespeare's history when you can experience it? Join today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. And now, back to the show. Arthur's image wasn't just in events and ceremonies. It shows up in literature as well, including Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, a long epic poem written in the 1590s that's full of allegory designed to flatter Elizabeth I. Andrew, how does Arthur appear in that work? And what do you think that portrayal would have meant to Elizabethan readers in terms of monarchy and national identity?
It's a really, really good question, and it's probably more complicated than you might imagine, which is interesting. I'm not convinced that The Faerie Queene is really designed just to flatter Elizabeth. I think it's a poem that's more about the nature of the monarchy. I very much doubt whether Elizabeth actually read it. I think quite a few courtiers would have read it. Queen was very busy, and it's very, very long, and she wouldn't necessarily have read it. And parts of it are actually pretty rude about her, really, because by the time Spenser writes his poem, Elizabeth is well past childbearing age. One of the things that's very strange about Elizabeth's reign, of course, is that people have been expecting her to die for a long time, and she goes on and on and on because she's incredibly robust. So there's probably about 15, 18 years when people have been expecting her to die in line with other kind of monarchs, because she makes it to, I think, 69, which is pretty old in those days. So probably from her early to mid 50s, people are really not expecting her to be around. So one of the things you get in the Fairy Queen is this whole question of the succession and whether Elizabeth had done the right thing, whether she should have married somebody, whether she has done the right thing in being the Virgin Queen. It explores the nature of the Virgin Queen. Now, one of the things that Arthur does is he generally appears in Canto 8. The book, The Fairy Queen, is in a series of books, 6 of which Spenser finished. You've got 12 cantos. Arthur generally appears in Canto 8 of the 12 cantos of each book to perform a rescue operation. Now, the most interesting one is in the first book, where Arthur appears as the great sort of legendary king who is going to rescue the Red Cross Knight from his imprisonment. And he writes about a vision he has of the Fairy Queen, which is incredibly powerful, where he talks about not knowing whether it was a dream or true, but they lay together. Now, it's clearly Spenser being quite transgressive and naughty, given that Elizabeth's whole image is based on her as a fairy queen. And here's this knight, this legendary king saying, and I kind of lay with the fairy queen. And then he says, but I can't find her again. She disappeared. And it's now 9 months into my journey, and I haven't been able to find her. Now, the 9 months is surely not accidental, but that idea that they had laid together, they could have produced a child, but they haven't, and the country hasn't got an heir. That's a real problem, because nobody knows what's going to happen by 1590, when Spenser writes the first part of the Fairy Queen. The Tudors are going to go. Their dynasty is not going to continue because Elizabeth hasn't produced any heirs. It's one of the perennial problems for the poor old Tudors. But Spenser's tale is perhaps using the Arthurian legends in a critical way to suggest that maybe Elizabeth, great monarch that she was, has found that time has caught up with her, and her strategy of not getting married, not producing children, is something that is really going to affect her and affect the nation. So Spenser is one of those who's perhaps pointing towards the negative side of the Arthurian legends, that the Arthurian legends point to a disaster, that after this great triumphant realm, Spenser's writing after the defeat of the Armada at a time where it's problematic. There's a lot of anxiety still. People were not convinced that the realm was completely safe, but there certainly had been great triumphs. There's the start of imperial voyages with Walter Raleigh, who's closely associated with Spenser. All this is great success, but it may well come crashing down, and nobody really knows what's going to happen after the Elizabethan reign. We think, well, it kind of goes okay because James I comes. James VI, as he then was of Scotland, comes down, and it all kind of works out okay. The Tudors didn't know that was going to happen. Tudor subjects didn't know that would be all right. There were all sorts of fears about what might happen after Elizabeth died. Spenser, of course, never got to find out because he dies in 1599, predeceasing Elizabeth. But his poem is a really interesting meditation, exploration of how the Arthurian legends can be used, the sort of things that they throw up, along with all sorts of other things, so that they point to an ending as well as a beginning, and quite a frightening ending.
It's always funny to me that the Tudors had so much worry about their legacy ending, and here we are still discussing them with great fervor close to 500 years later. I want to believe Elizabeth knew somehow that she was imbuing this lasting legacy with her scandalous life choices at the time. Outside of Spenser, Elizabethans had many other ways to encounter Arthurian stories. There were printed ballads, illustrated books, and engravings brought all of these legends to a wide audience, often blending entertainment with political messages. Andrew, what other Tudor-era literary or visual works featured these Arthurian themes, and how did they shape the public's view of Elizabeth?
I mentioned the misfortunes of Arthur which is a really, really fascinating play, appears in 1588, I think, if I remember correctly. That has Mordred as a powerful figure, and it's an incredibly anxious play. I mean, it appears at the time of the Armada. I suspect it was obviously written before the Armada was a triumph, and that shows Arthur as a rather foolish, overambitious king who spends his time saying, I'm going overseas on yet another campaign to protect the realm. And his subjects are going, please don't go, Your Majesty. Things are going to go bad. And Guinevere doesn't get a very good press in this either. She's seen as deranged and lustful and goes after Mordred, who is handsome and persuasive, but an absolute rotter and can't wait to get his hands on the throne and is using Guinevere. And it shows the whole of the realm going wrong. And in the end, Arthur manages to defeat Mordred, but Mordred is his illegitimate son, which again throws the succession into crisis. So that's a good example of the sort of negative or the anxiety-ridden representations of the Arthurian legend. The other one that people might have looked at, which I've alluded to a bit, is Thomas Malory's long prose epic, De Morte d'Arthur, which is a fabulously interesting book. Very, very long, largely about the knights, much of it translated from French. But that again is a plea for unity. It's got some very beautiful prose in it. There's bits towards the end where Malory, the narrator, seems to intervene. And there's one very moving passage where he intervenes to defend Guinevere. And he says, everyone says that Guinevere is, wanton and lascivious, but I defend her as a true lover, that she follows her kind of true vocation and is faithful to Lancelot, because she never really wanted to marry Arthur in the first place, and she has this tragic love for Lancelot. I mean, one of the famous things in medieval literature is that you often get is, what's the most famous kiss in medieval literature? And for many, it's the first kiss of Lancelot and Guinevere, because it's the kiss that destroys an empire. And these two lovers just can't stop their infatuation with each other, and it doesn't matter what happens. And that's one of the features of the Arthurian legends, that Lancelot wants to be loyal to Arthur, and he tries and he tries and he tries, but when he sees Guinevere, he just loses his reason because he's so besotted with her. So it's a very moving passage in Malory saying, no, you can't be rude about Guinevere. She's someone who does the right thing, really, in terms of and it's quite a startling passage. And the other passage in Malory where he says, there's a bit where everything goes right in the Arthurian Empire. And he says, look, he said, lo, you Englishmen, just remember, unity, you should be faithful to your monarch. Stop fighting these kind of terrible wars and stay behind one monarch, and then things will be much better. It's a wonderful book, and it is printed by one of the person who brings printing to Britain, William Caxton. It's reprinted quite often. So that's one. Those are two. The Misfortunes of Arthur is important play. Malory is important. There are other pageants I haven't referred to so much, but one of the other sort of uses of the Arthurian legends is very slightly later, with Prince Henry is the eldest son of James. Prince Henry, like poor old Arthur, and there's a kind of absolutely painful historical irony here. Henry is supposed to become king. He's a powerful, young, warlike man. He's praised as a kind of Arthurian figure. There's various pageants that have him as a kind of Arthurian warrior. Suddenly he gets ill and dies, and Charles I, who's never expected to be king and is much less belligerent and powerful than his elder brother, becomes king. So there's a sort of Arthurian death cycle there, if you like, where Henry dies. There's various pageants. One is written by Ben Jonson, who's elsewhere who, being a good humanist, is very skeptical about the Arthurian legends, but here sees fit to praise Henry as a sort of Arthurian figure. The set is designed by Inigo Jones with all sorts of Arthurian paraphernalia. So certainly there were court performances every now and again which represented somebody at court, the heir or the monarch, as an Arthurian figure, and those would have had great influence. In terms of a literate public, there's a work such as Malory, which is kind of used quite a lot in other works as well. So there's quite a lot about the Arthurian legends. I suppose just to finish on this note, there are some historians, notably a man called Sidney Anglo, who are quite skeptical about how much the Arthurian legends really mattered. Were they just sort of brought out at certain points? And there's some truth to that as well.
Speaking of paraphernalia, if we move away from words and performances, other aspects of life in Elizabethan England, like medals or even architectural details, would often be filled with these Arthurian symbols that the audiences of the time would have walked in, they'd have seen them, and they'd have recognized what that was right away. Are there surviving Tudor examples that incorporate Arthurian symbols? And what can they tell us about how Elizabethans visually linked their monarchy to this legend?
Well, one of the most famous ones that's quite often referred to is the Round Table in Winchester, which still exists, which is around in the 16th century. It's probably 13th century, I think. There's a couple of cases where foreign monarchs and dignitaries are taken to see it, but that's one of the main kind of physical artifacts. The main symbol that you often get is from Geoffrey of Monmouth, and this is an image of a red dragon conquering a white dragon, which is a sign of the triumph of the Britons over the Saxons. Now, that is incorporated into a lot of Tudor imagery to suggest that the Tudors are the heirs of the Britons and that they will incorporate the Saxons within them, so that they are both Britons and Saxons. That's very important for the Tudors, who aren't British yet. James the Sixth and First is the one who really transforms England into Britain, and it doesn't formally happen until the 18th century. But the Tudors were very keen to use their Welsh heritage to suggest that England and Wales should be incorporated, moving, I think, towards a larger unity of the British Isles. They were very keen to reconquer Ireland, where the Arthurian legends were used an awful lot in terms of claiming that Arthur had first conquered Ireland. But this image of the dragons fighting, you find in quite a lot of manuscripts and symbols in buildings, and that's something that's kind of very, very important. So that's perhaps the main symbol that you get within iconography.
Well, obviously, between the dragons and the tragic love stories and the political messaging of the Elizabethans, there is a ton to unpack and explore here when it comes to the legends of King Arthur in Shakespeare's lifetime. If we're new to this part of history and how it applies here in Shakespeare's life, where would you suggest we start if we want to learn more?
There is a brilliant book written in the 1950s called British Antiquity by a man called, I think it's T.D. Kendrick, which is pretty old now, but it's really, really good. And it kind of walks you through all the Arthurian legends. And that's the one that I would go for. There's a Cambridge Companion to the Arthurian legends. That's another one I would, a more modern book that I'd go for. But you can find very good thumbnail sketches of these things. There's a lot of works by a writer called Geoffrey Ashe, who is very good on the archaeology and the history of the legends. But I've always found, if you want to think about the 16th century and the Arthurian legends, British Antiquity is the one to go for.
We'll place links to these resources in the show notes for today's episode, along with Andrew Hadfield's work into this part of history, so you can stay tuned for the URL for where to find these. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, my assumption is that if I get onto a desert island, I'll be there for quite a long time. So I ought to take a really big book that's going to occupy me. So what I'd probably take is Dante's Divine Comedy, because I've read it in translation and I've read bits of it in Italian. And I've always been meaning to spend a large part of my life kind of getting to grips with it and getting better at speaking Italian. So I'd probably take that and spend several hours a day working on that. I think I probably need a dictionary as well, but I hope that's not cheating and having that
I don't think so. When you're taking on the project of digging into Dante's Divine Comedy, which is no small task in and of itself, but also using that as an opportunity to learn Italian, I think you've earned a bonus book. And so, yes, we would let you take the dictionary for sure. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I've just got a book out on mapping the world at the dawn of the British Empire, a traveller's guide with my colleague Matthew Dimmock. And I've done quite a lot of work on travel and colonial writing in the past, and I'm probably going to be doing a bit of work on that in the future. we've got a plan to jointly write a book on the significance of islands in the early modern period, which we're very excited about getting started on. Islands being important because as shipbuilding got better and people started to have longer sea voyages and think about setting up seaboard empires as well as trade, islands became really, really significant, and they're often ignored. A lot of early maps in the Middle Ages are all based on land maps, land masses. Suddenly, the sea becomes much more important and islands become important. And there's lots of really interesting islands. I'm also very interested in sheep. That's the other thing. I'm planning to write a book on the pastoral and sheep in medieval and Renaissance literature. Lots of people write books about pastoral literature that has lots of sheep in them. There's lots of agricultural history that talks about the significance of sheep in determining the English landscape and all sorts of other landscapes in the medieval and early modern period. Those two aren't always put together. There's not always that much linkage between the reality of sheep and sheep farming and the great spread of sheep and its representation in literature. And I'd like to write something about that. Quite a short book, I think.
That all sounds very exciting. We love maps around here, especially history ones that show us where things were taking place. And I am really excited about the sheep exploration. This sounds like so much fun. Andrew Hadfield, thank you so much for being here this week and taking us through the history of King Arthur and how it was alive and well in the life of William Shakespeare. It's been fun taking a look at this part of history with you here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Cassidy. It's been great fun to talk to you.
That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed stepping into the Tudor world where Arthur's Camelot was more than a myth. It was a mirror for Elizabeth's England. If you'd like to see the portraits, manuscripts, and pageant illustrations we discussed today, remember that those details are located inside the extras at CassidyCash.com/episode 398. That's CassidyCash.com/episode 398. Until next time, keep the history in your Shakespeare, the adventure in your research, and the magic in your storytelling. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.